One document in this story was small enough to fit inside a bottle. The other was large enough to hang 4 men. The bottle said murder. The men who had taken the ship needed the shore to believe it was only bad seamanship. That is the whole problem. Everything else in this episode is the distance between those two sentences. Lennie was a working wooden barque when she cleared Antwerp in October 1875. 3 masts, about 984 tons. Built 4 years earlier at Belliveau's Cove in Nova Scotia for a pair of Canadian owners who wanted a ship that could carry cargo across the North Atlantic without distinction and without incident. She left the Scheldt estuary in ballast, meaning empty of paying freight, moving toward American orders that had not yet been confirmed. No famous cargo, no storied name. Just a vessel doing what working vessels do. Sailing toward the next thing. The disaster that followed did not begin with weather. It did not begin with a dangerous coast or a rotten hull. It began with people hired at the last minute to work a ship they did not yet trust, under officers they had only just met, on a voyage that was already moving before anyone had learned to read each other. The crew list reads like the hiring board of a busy port: Greeks, Turks, an Austrian, an Italian, a Dane, an Englishman, a Belgian steward, and a young understeward. Men assembled quickly from the London and Antwerp labor market, thrown together by the logic of departure dates and available bodies. Those nationalities would later become part of the story, told around the case in court and in the press. Dangerous foreigners, an ungovernable mix. That framing was a convenience, not an explanation. The problem aboard Lennie was simpler and harder to fix than origin. These were men who had no shared history, no accumulated reason to trust the officers above them, placed inside a command structure that assumed trust was already there. When it turned out it was not, the ship had already left the last port where that could have been corrected. Constant van Hoydonck joined Lennie as the steward. That was how the crew agreement knew him, a Belgian national responsible for provisions, the domestic management of the vessel, the kind of work that keeps a ship running without being visible from the deck. He was not an officer. He held no command, but he was, as it turned out, the only man aboard who could navigate. A later Nova Scotian maritime history gives this detail its weight. When the officers were dead, when the deck belonged to men who had just made themselves unable to return to any port as free men, the ship still had to go somewhere. A barque does not drift to safety on its own. Someone had to read the stars, calculate the position, work the course. The only person aboard who could do that was the Belgian steward. Van Hoydonck understood what that meant for his survival before anyone had to explain it. He was useful. As long as he remained useful, killing him was a problem for the men who now controlled the deck. The moment he stopped being useful, he was only a witness. He spent the days after the murders below deck, behind a fastened hatch, listening to the ship above him and deciding hour by hour what kind of useful he needed to be. Henri Trousselot was the understeward. Young, below Van Hoydonck in the ship's hierarchy, which means he was at the bottom of what was already the lower end of the vessel's social order. Most retellings bring him in for the bottle. He is the boy with the message, the dramatic image that gives the case its most portable detail. That image is real. He did help throw the bottles overboard, but focus only on the gesture and you miss what made it dangerous. He was not saving a ship by force. He was saving the truth by handwriting on a vessel where the men who controlled the deck did not yet know what was being written below them. Every word he put on that paper was a sentence that could get him killed if the wrong person found it. He trusted ink and glass and the Atlantic current more than he trusted the men above him. That is not a romantic act. It is a cold calculation made by someone who had very few options and chose the one that required the most nerve. He later appears in the same Humane Society award list as Van Hoydonck, recognized for what he did at sea. The record remembers both names. It does not say how frightened either of them was. The mistake that started everything was not a conspiracy. It was a tacking maneuver that went wrong. Tacking for a barque meant swinging the bow through the wind so the ship could change direction. It required every man on deck working in coordination at the braces, the lines that controlled the yards, adjusting sail and rope in a sequence that only worked if everyone moved when they were supposed to. That morning, the sequence broke down, braces fouled. The maneuver stuttered, and Captain Stanley Hatfield, already carrying whatever weeks of frustration a captain carries when a crew has been failing to satisfy him, said the thing that closed the last negotiable distance between command and violence. The insult, in essence, was that they were soldiers, not seamen, men who could not handle a ship, said in front of the whole deck. There is a kind of insult that a professional man cannot absorb and still believe he has standing aboard the vessel where he works. Hatfield may have thought he was correcting a crew. He was ending a relationship. By the time the words were out, the gap between what he thought his authority still was and what his authority actually was had closed to nothing. The argument was already on a deck with knives in reach. Before all this, there was still the ordinary shape of a commercial voyage. Antwerp fell behind, then the Scheldt, then the Belgian coast, and then the broad gray entry to the North Atlantic, where the legal geography of ports and police and witnesses gives way to the older geography of depth and distance. A merchant barque at sea existed inside a small, closed world. Its order was not enforced from outside. It depended on rank, on the accumulated weight of custom, and on the practical belief that everyone aboard still needed everyone else to reach port alive. Officers needed crew. Crew needed officers who knew where they were going. When that mutual dependence fractured, there was nothing to appeal to. The nearest law was wherever the ship happened to be pointing. In court later, the sequence before the murders would be made to look almost inevitable. Warning signs, rising tension, a crew gathering with intent. That is what prosecution narratives do. They arrange the past so that violence looks like it was always coming, so that the men in the dock can be understood as having chosen this from the beginning. What the officers saw in the days before, what they understood about the mood on their own deck, is harder to know. Men who can testify about warning signs are usually the ones who survive them. The 3 officers aboard Lennie did not survive. The clearest sequence begins not with conspiracy, but with early morning work. Attack ordered before dawn. Men called up before they expected it. Cold, half awake, already tired. The braces handled badly. An officer's anger arriving on a deck that had run out of patience for it. Then the sequence compresses. Captain Stanley Hatfield is stabbed. That is the first confirmed point of no return. Once a captain has been stabbed on his own deck, the men who did it are no longer sailors who have crossed a line. They are men who cannot afford to let the ship reach a port with anyone aboard who disagrees with their version of what happened. First mate Joseph Wortley is killed. Second mate Richard MacDonald is killed. 3 officers, in sequence. That is what changes the shape of the crime from a moment of violence into something that requires a name. The third death means the first 2 were not accidents of passion. Somewhere between the first knife and the third, enough decision passed that the word murder becomes difficult to avoid. 3 bodies given to the Atlantic. No command left alive. A ship at sea with a crew that now owned a problem they could not sail away from. After the murders, the deck belonged to the men who had done it. Below the hatch, Van Hoydonck listened. He could hear the ship above him, the sound of lines, feet on wood, the creak of a hull under wind. He could hear voices but not words. He knew the officers were dead. He knew what that meant for anyone aboard who had not participated. He was alone with that knowledge in the space below the deck, behind a covering that the men above him could open whenever they decided it was time. The hours between the murders and the first contact with any outside authority are the gap at the center of this case. We do not know every word spoken on that deck. We do not know the exact story the mutineers assembled or how long it took them to agree on it. What we know is the result. When help eventually came, they had a version ready. Weather, misfortune, officers lost at sea through circumstances that left no one alive to contradict. Van Hoydonck spent those hours deciding what kind of useful he needed to be. He understood that his navigational knowledge was the only thing standing between him and the same fate as Hatfield, Wortley, and MacDonald. He gave the men above him what they needed on the surface. He agreed to navigate. He took the course they wanted, or appeared to, while quietly working the ship toward the French coast, toward the nearest place where outside authority existed and might be willing to board. Whether that was a plan he formed in the first hours or something that grew through fear and necessity, we cannot say with certainty. What the outcome shows is that it worked. Below deck, Trousselot was writing, multiple messages, sealed into bottles, specific enough to describe what had happened, desperate enough to ask for help, careful enough to be worth throwing into the Atlantic rather than keeping aboard a ship where discovery meant death. The bottles went over the side, into the current, into the gap between the ship's controlled story and any reader who might find them. The men above deck had position and numbers. Van Hoydonck and Trousselot had paper and glass, and the hope that the ocean would carry what the deck could not be allowed to say. Above deck, the performance continued. A ship in difficulty had a grammar that port authorities recognized. Weather damage, navigational trouble, a chronometer problem, men lost to ordinary maritime misfortune. These were the acceptable losses of commercial sail. They fit the legal language of maritime loss reports. They fit the kind of story a crew could tell without anyone on shore having strong reason to disbelieve. The Travailleur, a French gunboat, came alongside off the coast. French authorities boarded. What was said on deck in those first minutes, what the mutineers offered as explanation, the record does not preserve in full. What it shows is the outcome. The arrests followed the boarding. The ship stopped. The men were taken into custody. Whether a bottle message had already reached the coast and set the boarding in motion, or whether the boarding happened through other means, the surviving record does not say with complete certainty. What it says is that the shore arrived before the mutineers could arrive at the shore on their own terms. That was the first moment the case began to leave their control. When French authority came alongside, the problem changed shape. Until that moment, the men who controlled the deck were still operating in the gap between the murders and any institution powerful enough to ask what had happened. That gap had been their protection. A ship at sea, outside territorial waters, beyond the reach of any single legal system, was a space where a story could hold simply because there was no one present to contradict it. The boarding ended that. Lennie stopped being a floating problem and became an international one. There were now two governments involved, a ship full of men with contradictory accounts, and a chain of paper that would eventually reach London and the machinery of English law. 3 officers could not testify. Their bodies were in the Atlantic. The court was not just asking who killed them. It was asking what kind of story the law was willing to believe. A modern study quoting the Old Bailey indictment notes that 8 men were charged with willful murder on the high seas within Admiralty jurisdiction, meaning under the reach of English courts over crimes committed on the ocean beyond any nation's territory. The absence of the bodies did not collapse the case. It shifted the weight entirely onto testimony, onto the messages that had escaped the ship, and onto what the surviving witnesses were prepared to say under oath. Popular accounts call this the Lennie Mutiny. That label is fair as a summary. It captures the shape: crew against officers, a ship taken by force, a command structure destroyed. But the Old Bailey did something narrower. 8 men were indicted for willful murder on the high seas, not for mutiny as a separate offense under naval law. A modern study of the case is explicit on this point. The verdict was murder. Murder was the charge the law could hang them for, and at the Old Bailey in 1876, it did. My read, this distinction is not a technicality that matters only to lawyers. It is the moment the case stops being a story about a ship and becomes a test of which version of events a court was willing to formalize. Van Hoydonck and Trousselot had held the written record, and they had released it into the current before the ship could reach shore and reframe everything. The court's job was to decide whether that record was true. It decided that it was. There is a version of this story that would give Trousselot a more dramatic pedigree, a family connection to diplomatic circles that might make the pursuit of the case feel almost engineered from above. That detail circulates in some accounts. The sources open for this episode do not confirm it, so this episode does not use it. Source discipline matters most when the unconfirmed detail would make the story better. This one would. That is precisely the moment to leave it out. 8 men entered the Old Bailey record. 4 names ended at Newgate Prison: Matteo Cargalis, Giovanni Carcaris, Pascalis Kaludis, George Kaida. Their executions are confirmed. The other 4 indicted men did not face the same sentence. Though the surviving record available for this episode does not specify what distinguished those outcomes, whether degree of participation, evidence of specific acts, or something in the testimony. That belongs to the full trial record. What the executions tell us is which version of Lennie's missing days the law accepted. The officers were murdered, the gap was closed. The story the mutineers had assembled on deck did not hold against what came ashore by paper and glass. Van Hoydonck and Trousselot did not disappear into the court file. A later Liverpool shipwreck and Humane Society award list carries both names under acts at sea. The institutions of maritime commerce in this period were oriented toward officers and ship owners. A steward and an understeward appearing in that list, recognized for what they did while trapped on a ship they could not control, is not nothing. It tells us that the people who evaluated what happened aboard Lennie, after the trial, after the executions, understood that something was done on that vessel that deserved to be called courage. The award list does not say what it cost either of them to do it. It only says that someone later thought it was worth writing down. The bottle stays in popular memory because it is a clean object, a sealed glass container, a folded note, the image of a warning drifting across open water towards someone who might be able to help. The harder object is the paper trail that followed. Indictment, testimony, verdict. None of that is as vivid as a bottle. All of it is what actually decided what happened aboard Lennie would be called. The Lennie case is not just a story about a warning that reached shore. It is a story about what shore did with the warning once it arrived. A message in a bottle can alert a coast. It cannot by itself decide what a court is willing to call murder. That required sworn testimony, a formal indictment, and the willingness of an English court to look at 3 men killed aboard a barque in the North Atlantic and use the right word for it. My read, the famous bottle did not save the story from the sea. It forced the story into records that could be tested, contradicted, and finally judged. The bottle did not solve the Lennie case by itself. It forced the paper trail ashore, where murder could no longer dress itself as bad seamanship.